Welcome to Doing the Work, a Naples Integrated Recovery podcast. My name is Brian, and this space is for anyone who's tired of surviving the same emotional and behavioral loops, whether that's anxiety, trauma, addiction, or problems in your relationships. Around here, we cut the surface level advice and sugarcoating, no platitudes or bumper sticker wisdom. We focus on clarity, responsibility, emotional discipline, and the courage to look at yourself honestly so that you can stop repeating old patterns and start living with intention instead of reaction. Let's get into it. Good morning. It is January 11th. And one thing that I think a lot of people know is that I normally do this podcast and have stuff that is recorded for several months out, and I cleared and changed the entire schedule of all the content that I have been putting out to record this morning because of what is unfolding in the nation right now that I think really needs to be addressed directly. Not to react, not to take a side, but to help people slow down thinking in real time. The point of this episode is not headlines, it is about fear shaping conclusions as it happens. And one of the core frameworks that I use when working with clients is DBT, Dialectical Behavior Therapy. And I want to start by naming that framework explicitly because without it, this entire conversation is going to fall apart. DBT is built on one core idea that a lot of people resist, especially when the mind is stressed. Two things can be true at the same time, even if they appear to contradict each other, and neither one cancels the other out. That principle is called dialectics. Dialectics is not compromise. It's not balance. It's not, both sides are kind of right. Dialectics means refusing to collapse reality into a single truth when a situation actually requires holding more than one thing to be true. And tragedy is where dialectics either show up or disappear completely. After a death, especially one that involves authority, violence, fear, people do not argue facts, they argue meaning. And under fear, the human mind pushes toward single truth explanations, like, if the cops were involved, it's abuse of power. Or, if she didn't comply, that's on her, she made her choice. Or, fear excuses everything, or the law excuses everything. All of those are non-dialectical positions, and whichever camp you feel like you fall in, these can feel stabilizing, morally clean, and they are also not whole and inaccurate. DBT exists because human beings do this under stress. We reduce complexity in order to regulate fear. And a concept in DBT, wise mind, is the discipline of refusing that reduction. DBT describes three states of mind: emotion mind, reasonable mind, and wise mind. These aren't personality traits, they are modes of processing. Emotion mind is not having emotions. Emotion mind is emotion deciding. So in emotion mind, we have fear that drives conclusions, urgency that replaces sequencing, certainty that replaces probability, and narratives that are replacing analysis. Emotion mind answers one question: what feels true right now? And after tragedy, emotion mind dominates by default. That is not a character issue, it's part of neurobiology. Reasonable mind is facts, timelines, rules, threshold, logic, and for reasonable mind, order matters, standards matter, causality matters, and outcomes are separated from intention. reasonable mind answers a different question: what happened, in order, according to which rules? And reasonable mind by itself can be very rigid. So, for example, I have a few clients who are highly analytical. One is an engineer, or I think about my dad, who was a brilliant scientist. And sometimes if this reasonable mind part is driving, then there's not enough balance for empathy and emotion. Reasonable mind alone can be rigid. It can miss shock, grief, and human limitation, and it can apply standards correctly but miss what the situation was requiring. Now, overlap the two. Venn diagram is how I usually have seen this outlined in like DBT manuals. In the middle between the two is what's called wise mind. And this is where people can get confused, because wise mind is not halfway between emotion mind and halfway between reasonable mind. It is the dialectical integration of both. Wise mind answers a third question: given the facts and the emotional reality, what is the most accurate and effective response? So wise mind is a synthesis of grief and agency, fear and standards, explanation and accountability. This holds human limitation and consequences for our choices. And wise mind does not resolve tension, it just contains it. That containment is very uncomfortable, and it's also necessary. Fear is not a secondary factor here, it's the central mechanism, because fear narrows our attention, it reduces tolerance for ambiguity, and it pushes the brain towards certainty instead of accuracy. So from a neuroscience standpoint, when fear is activated, your amygdala has increased dominance, the prefrontal cortex becomes less active, your sequencing degrades, probability assessment weakens, and global confusions feel correct. This happens during the event and after it. After a death, fear remains elevated and the nervous system starts looking for meaning that restores a sense of safety. But here is a key point. Under fear, the brain prefers a single, absolute explanation instead of a complex, accurate one. And that preference is what's destroying dialectics. So here is an example I read this morning, and this is actually the reason that I decided to record this and felt like there was really an explanation of how complex this situation is. Today I read that a celebrity was quoted saying, "Obey or die, unaccountable armed government agents acting with impunity." And that statement is not an analysis, it's fear language. It takes a specific incident involving specific people, specific behaviors and conditions, and then converts it into a universal rule. And that feels clarifying when fear is present because it reduces uncertainty. But it's also an exact example of dialectics disappearing. Dialectical thinking requires holding two truths to be true at the same time. Fear of unchecked authority can be reasonable, absolutely. And a single incident does not define every encounter or erase context. Emotion mind cannot hold both, so it collapses it into one. And from a brain perspective, language like this activates your threat circuitry. Once threat circuitry is dominated, the prefrontal cortex, that's your rational decision-making part of the brain, contributes less sequencing, probability assessment, and nuance. Your certainty increases, accuracy decreases. You can see emotion mind at work when people are turning a specific incident into a universal rule. Obey or die is not an analysis. It is a fear-driven conclusion, and it is divisive. It takes a specific situation, specific actions, specific conditions, and converts it into a general prediction, global threat narrative, and it feels clarifying because it reduces uncertainty. Part of my work with clients, part of my own self-work is learning how to sit in the discomfort of uncertainty. And all of that shuts out the reasonable mind part that I talked about earlier. With this DBT perspective, this is emotion mind collapsing dialectics, because a dialectical truth would be this incident is tragic, it involves specific behaviors, and it does not automatically define all future encounters with law enforcement. An emotion mind refuses that complexity. After a tragedy, reasonable mind is often labeled as cruel, cold, or inhuman. And that reaction is predictable, it makes sense, because reasonable mind threatens emotion mind's attempt to regulate fear through certainty. But without reasonable mind, then causality disappears. Prevention becomes impossible, and everything turns into moral allegiance instead of an analysis. DBT is not asking for you to remove emotion mind. It's encouraging you to be aware, not to allow emotion mind to run the system. This episode is built around several dialectical truths that must coexist. It's meant to stretch thinking, and it may make you uncomfortable. A woman is dead, and agency still exists. Fear explains behavior. It does not erase responsibility. Standards apply, and human limitations matter. Systems influence outcomes, and individuals still choose. And if any of those is removed, then the entire analysis collapses. Wise mind is the capacity to hold them simultaneously without removing tension, and there is tension. So if me saying any of that stirred something up inside you, just notice that. Dialectics are very uncomfortable because they deny emotional closure that we're looking for. Emotion mind wants a clean story, and reasonable mind wants a clear rule. Wise mind does not allow you to have either, but it tolerates ambiguity, discomfort, and unresolved questions. That tolerance is not emotional maturity, it's cognitive discipline. So all of that was a necessary foundation, as I'm going to now break down both sides of what happened, at least from what we are reading in newspaper articles or watching from videos. But I'm going to apply dialectical thinking directly to a civilian behavior under fear. And at the same time, hold me accountable too. Fear is real, it's constraining, but choices also occur, and avoidable is not the same as deserved. I'm not asking you to pick a side. I'm asking you to try to see if you can tolerate two truths at the same time, because this is the work. I laid out this dialectical behavioral therapy and wise mind being the integration rather than compromise, and how fear pushes people toward one of these single truth explanations. Now we're going to apply this framework to the conversation that people either soften or weaponize civilian behavior under acute fear. Fear constrains choice, and choice still exists. Both parts of this sentence are true, neither cancels the other. Emotion mind tries to turn fear into a complete excuse, and reasonable mind, if left alone, tries to pretend that fear doesn't matter. Wise mind holds both. Under acute stress, the nervous system shifts into threat mode. That is not theoretical, it's measurable physiology. Your adrenaline spikes, cortisol increases, heart rate is going fast, attention narrows, cognitive flexibility drops. When I was a police officer in Illinois, I had a friend who was in a shooting. To shorten that story, a person who had a terminal illness diagnosis thought that it would be easier to have a cop end his life for him. So he went into the lobby of a police station to file an accident report, quote unquote accident, and ended up pulling a gun on this police officer. And from this officer's perspective, after he was able to talk about the shooting, told me, all I saw, he said, it was the craziest thing ever. The lobby of the police station vanished. All I saw was a gun magnified and in my face. It was the biggest fucking gun I've ever seen in my life, and it was in my face. Just imagine that. So I think you got to think that this is like part of what is going on with this situation in Minneapolis. Is there's not rational, reasonable thinking and dissecting all of this in real time. It's total panic on both sides, driver and police officer. From a decision-making standpoint, several things reliably happen here. Your options feel fewer, time feels compressed, delay feels safer than movement, and authority pressure feels threatening, not clarifying. This explains why people freeze, stall, argue, or escalate verbally. It doesn't explain away agency either, and that distinction is not semantic, it's central to all of this. If fear eliminated our agency, then training, de-escalation, and prevention would all be meaningless concepts. DBT wouldn't even exist. Dialectics require us to say, fear shapes our behavior in the moment, and behavior still matters. After a death, emotion mind hears any kind of a discussion about behavior as blame, and that is an emotional translation, not a logical one. Emotional mind hears her actions increased her risk, and it converts it to she deserved what she got or what happened. And that conversion is false. It shuts down analysis, and wise mind refuses that conversion. What avoidable actually means, the word avoidable is where emotion mind reacts the hardest, and it needs to be defined precisely. Avoidable is not a moral judgment or a retroactive condemnation. Avoidable is a probability statement. Avoidable means that there were decision points, there were alternative actions that could have happened, and that those alternatives could have reduced risk. That's it. It does not mean that the outcome that happened was justified. It doesn't mean that this woman deserved harm, or that fear didn't matter, or that the system is correct in how the law is applied. Dialectically, the truth is, it can be tragic that someone dies, and true that different choices would have likely produced a different outcome. Both of those statements can coexist. This is where reasonable mind really has to stay online. Certain behaviors increase risk during high-stake encounters, and certain behaviors decrease them. Exiting a vehicle when you're instructed lowers risk. Compliance with law enforcement lowers risk. Reducing verbal antagonism lowers risk. Those statements are not ideological, they are empirical. Recognizing that does not require liking it, it requires being accurate. All of those are true. They're undeniably true. Emotion mind rejects these truths because it feels unfair in the circumstance. But fairness does not change how risk operates. Wise mind accepts this reality without endorsing either outcome. And this is why people really fight dialectics. People resist acknowledging agency under fear because it feels threatening. If agency exists under fear, then that means that my worst moments matter. My fear doesn't protect me from consequences. My intentions don't guarantee safety. Emotion mind responds by erasing agency entirely, and that response feels compassionate, but it's dangerous, because if agency disappears under stress, then prevention disappears with it. Wise mind prioritizes prevention over comfort. And here's where I want to be very precise about my own history. I think most people know I'm ex-law enforcement, and it directly illustrates reasonable mind, emotion mind, and wise mind in real life, not a theory. So I was a 12-year police officer, and being a good police officer does not mean operating in pure reasonable mind. It requires wise mind. You have to be able to apply letter of the law and spirit of the law at the same time, often with incomplete information, time, and pressure. If policing was only based on rigid rule application, everybody listening to this podcast would have been arrested at some point, because there is a law for freaking everything. Discretion is not optional, it's a fundamental part of law enforcement. That's wise mind in action. And at the same time, there can be moments where my focus on facts and sequencing was correct, but incomplete. So I've told this story a handful of times when I was in grad school. Kind of shows how much I've shifted from my law enforcement thinking. But one moment really stands out. I was a detective and I was conducting a death investigation. I don't remember if it was a suicide. I don't remember what it was. And I was doing exactly what this detective role required, establishing a timeline, identifying last contact, documenting the details of the scene, who's been in and out, reviewing medical history, determining anybody else that might have been involved. I was organized and accurate. And what I was not doing was registering the fact that the person right in front of me, who I was interviewing, was in shock and actively grieving the death of a family member. And I remember at one point, this woman that I was speaking with stopped and said, "Are you even a human being?" Because I was operating in full-blown reasonable mind, not emotion mind, not wise mind. And that statement really matters, not because that was wrong of me to collect facts and a timeline. That's all a critical part of being a detective, but because I was missing something else that really mattered. The dialectic in that moment and in that interaction was, this investigation required facts, and the person in front of me had just lost somebody that was very, very close to them or a family member and was, in shock. Both are true. I was doing the job correctly and incompletely. And that moment clarifies something essential for me. Wise mind is not just a flexible rule application. It includes recognizing when fear, shock, or grief is shaping an interaction and then adjusting how you engage without abandoning standards. And this applies everywhere, not just policing. So let's bring this back to civilians. This does not make people, citizens, disposable. It doesn't make people deserving of harm. It doesn't erase humanity, but it also does not erase agency. Dialectically, fear explains behavior and behavior affects outcomes. Wise mind holds both. So before I move into this next section, I want to review. Fear constrains choice, but, or and, because it's all about an and with wise mind. Fear constrains choice, and choice still exists. Avoidable does not mean deserved. Reasonable mind without context is incomplete, and emotion mind without standards or laws is dangerous. So now I'm going to shift to the officer's nervous system, threat perception, training, and where explanation stops and accountability begins. Up to this point, I've been deliberate about staying inside this concept of dialectics, not because it's comfortable, but because without it, this conversation turns into ideology or who's right instead of a true analysis. Now we have to also apply the same discipline to the part that a lot of people don't want to look at, the officer's side. Dialectics require symmetry, not moral symmetry, but human symmetry. And if we examine civilian fear without treating officers like a villain or programmed robot, then we abandon wise mind. This is a central dialectical statement for this section. Officers can experience fear and threat perception, and that perception does not automatically justify lethal force. Both parts are true, neither cancels the other out. Emotion mind collapses this into one truth or the other. Wise mind refuses to do that. It requires sitting in the discomfort of both things being true at the same time. Police officers do not operate outside of human biology. They operate inside of it, shaped by training, experience, and repeated exposure to threat. And from a neurobiological standpoint, an officer experiences the same stress response as a civilian does. The amygdala activation, the narrowed attention, compressed time perception, and reduced cognitive flexibility. Training does not remove fear. Training shapes what fear is associated with, and officers are trained to treat vehicles in motion as a potential lethal weapon. This training exists because there are officers that are killed by vehicles every year. This is not speculative. It is just empirical truth. There are numerous videos that you could watch that show officers being run over in high-risk situations. So, if an officer perceives noncompliance, verbal antagonism, unpredictable movement, a vehicle shifting into drive after being told to stop or to get out, acceleration, whether that's arguably toward their position or away or in a forward motion, these cues stack. And stacked threat cues acceleration of a fear response, and it compresses decision-making windows. So, this explains escalation. It does not automatically justify lethal force. Dialectics require us to hold that distinction without flinching. Emotion mind wants to pull people toward two opposing collapses. One collapse says, if the officer felt threatened, then the outcome makes sense. The other says, that outcome was wrong, so the officer's fear doesn't matter. And both feel emotionally satisfying, and they are both incorrect or not whole. Reasonable mind, not ideology, has to step in here. Reasonable mind is where standards live. Reasonable mind says, was there an imminent threat? What was the distance or trajectory? Were there other alternatives available? Was lethal force absolutely necessary in this moment? And these are not accusations, they are use of force criteria. Fear is a factor, but fear is not the trump-all card. Dialectically, fear explains perception, and standards determine justification. If we lose either side, then we lose accountability. And this part is uncomfortable. It's where people retreat. For some listeners, acknowledging officer fear sounds like you're excusing violence or death. And for others, questioning lethal force feels like betrayal of authority. These are reactions that are emotional mind responses. Wise mind tolerates the discomfort instead of resolving it prematurely. Reasonable mind is not about assigning blame. It's about identifying points of intervention. And without reasonable mind, then police training cannot improve, policies don't adapt or laws don't adapt, thresholds remain vague, and we are likely to see the same mistakes or the same painful events continue to take place. Emotion mind produces outrage cycles. Reasonable mind produces revisions. Wise mind integrates both into prevention. And if prevention matters, then reasonable mind has to stay online after tragedy. Let's restate the core of dialectics clearly without softening. So this is kind of where we are at in this conversation. A woman is dead and her own agency existed. Fear was present, and fear does not erase responsibility. The officer perceived threat, and perception does not equal justification. Systems influence outcomes, and individuals still act. Grief matters, and standards still apply. If any of these is removed, the entire analysis collapses to this narrative of obey or get killed, and that is emotion mind. Wise mind is the discipline of holding both of these truths simultaneously. People reduce dialectics because dialectics deny certainty, and our brains are wired to want certainty, even if it's not fully true. Emotion mind wants a clean story, reasonable mind wants a clean rule, and wise mind offers neither. It offers containment, sitting with unresolved tension, resisting moral shortcuts, and refusing to outsource thinking to fear. That is cognitively demanding, and it's the reason that people avoid it. So, I'm going to leave you with a challenge or a homework assignment: dialectical, not emotional. This episode is not about this case alone. It's about how you think when fear is present. Here is a challenge stated plainly. When you feel morally certain after a tragedy, pause and ask yourself, what emotion is driving my conclusion? What second truth am I refusing to hold? Am I collapsing an explanation into a justification? Am I letting the outcome decide causality? Then ask, am I in emotion mind? Am I in reason mind? Or am I practicing wise mind by holding both? Wise mind is not a feeling, it's a cognitive discipline. It is hard work. Dialectics do not make tragedy acceptable, they make it usable for learning, prevention, and restraint. Wise mind, after tragedy, does not offer comfort, it offers accuracy, and accuracy is the only thing that reduces repetition. So I want to end this episode without a resolution, because resolution is usually a lie that we tell ourselves to feel better. Dialectics in this case does not resolve this tragedy, it prevents distortion. Wise mind is not asking you to excuse what happened, it's asking you not to condemn everybody that is involved, and it asks you to stop collapsing reality when fear is present. This was tragic, it was avoidable, fear mattered and was part of this, agency existed, and standards apply. These statements do not compete with each other. In fact, they all belong together. And if you walk away from this episode uncomfortable or upset with me, I might posit that that is evidence that you're not shortcutting how challenging it is to sit in wise mind. because wise mind after a tragedy is not about calm, it's about being accurate when accuracy is the hardest thing ever. And if there's one thing worth practicing right now, it is that if you feel certain, slow down. If you feel morally clean, look for what you might be excluding. And if you feel pulled that you must pick a side, then ask, what's the second truth that you're avoiding? This is what dialectics look like outside of therapy rooms and textbooks. It's messy. It's not balance. It's not neutrality. Discipline. And that is doing the work. Thanks for spending the time with me. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with somebody who may need to hear it. Be kind to yourself. Be kind to others around you. Remember that we're all doing the best that we can with the tools that we currently have, and we are all capable of growing past them. If you'd like to reach out or connect, send me an email, brian@naplesintegratedrecovery.com. I hope to hear from you there, and in the meantime, thanks again for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.